Hey guys, so this is the re-recording of my economic impact of immigration video, and I'll be talking primarily about the Nordic perspective for reasons that we'll come to. So hopefully the sound quality is better this time. I bought like a more expensive microphone and should be okay. So if you don't know a particular topic, one way of trying to figure out what to believe on the topic would be to consult kind of like expert opinion on the topic. And of course, if experts don't really always agree, everybody, on some particular question, so the natural thing is to look for either like very prominent experts or like a survey of experts or some kind of aggregation. And if we think about this approach and for immigration, one thing to do is that you can find surveys of economists. And there's a website, the IGM Economic Experts Panel, which is more or less as it thinks. It's basically a website where they have convinced, 100 maybe of the top famous economists. And so these will be like big name economists like Krugman and some of these other Asimoglu, I don't know how to pronounce this. And anyway, so they polled these experts, economists, on a lot of questions, and one of them was about refugees in Germany, and so they were polling them on in 2017, and so they're asking the influx of refugees into Germany beginning in the last, in 2015 will generate net economic benefits for German citizens over the succeeding decade, right? So they're asking this was the huge immigrant waves that came in 2015 and so on, and so they're asking, will they generate net economic benefit? And that's one to focus on, right? So net economic benefit, that's all the money that they're bringing into the German state, so to say, and minus all the money that they're spending in healthcare or education or just unemployment benefits or anything else you can think of. And so it specifically asks about German citizens. So my interpretation is that it would have to be a benefit to the Germans already living there, is taking in these refugees, and from the refugee crisis a net benefits, economically speaking, for the German citizens in the next 10 years, right, succeeding decade. And so if you look at what the kind of raw results are, it's these ones, and you can kind of see the experts are pretty much split between two opinions, which is agree, which is yes, they're affirming that it will be net benefit, and then a bunch of people who say they're uncertain, or a few who say no opinion. And one way you can kind of modify this result is to weigh by the expert's confidence. So every time they ask an expert their opinion, they can strongly agree, and so on. They also ask them how sure are you about this belief in a kind of typical like rationalist kind of perspective. And if you weigh them, it doesn't really change results much. It looks like this. So it appears to be that according to the top world experts, say on economics, that about half of them think that these taking the refugees will be a net economic benefit, and the other ones are like uncertain, right? But we do have reason to be skeptical, because of course we know that if you are to publicly associate your name with some opinion that's controversial, which is just to say the media doesn't like it, then you're probably reluctant to do this. Because you don't really want to get shamed. And so we'd expect a lot of people who actually think who actually disagree to say nothing or just don't vote or anything. So what we're going to do instead in this video is that we're going to be looking at actual like results that do attempt to calculate net contributions for these for various immigrants, refugees, people who came to work, and so on. And I'm going to be relying primarily on the results from the Nordic countries. And so this is like Denmark, Norway, Sweden, and then Finland, which is not Scandinavia, but it's sort of Scandinavian. And there's a few reasons to focus on these countries. The first one is that, generally speaking, these countries are global front runners. And by this, I mean, whenever you look at like some kind of country ranking of bad stuff or good stuff, these countries will generally always be at least in the top 20, or more often like top 10. Like you can look at corruption and so on. They're very low corruption, very high Nobel Prize winners per capita, this sort of thing. So if these countries are unable to make something work, then maybe it's not possible to make it work. The second reason to do the Nordic countries is that they have great register data. And so this may seem weird to Americans or something, but generally speaking, what happens is that all the government databases, they have a unique ID for every person. In Denmark, it's called the CPR, the Central Person Register. And so basically, whenever you are born, or even sometimes when you migrate, if you get like a permanent residence, you get assigned one of these numbers. And this number is used to track you across every database. And so recently, maybe the last 10 years or so, 10, 15 years maybe, they've allowed access to these central registries to researchers. So it's not just they're giving you the data, but you can log into their like special system and you can do some computations. Anyway, but what it does is that it allows researchers to examine scientific questions, including questions of economics, by using the state data, right? The state data. So you're not doing a survey of people and trying to, sampling error and so on. You're literally looking at the entire population. And so the main limitation of these studies is that the population size sometimes is just not sufficient. But for these purposes, for this video, it's definitely sufficient. And the third reason is that there's a long history of doing like detailed reports for public consumption based on this kind of register data. Usually these are made by the governments. So often it's going to be like the Ministry of Economics or Department of Economics or some kind of consulting company that they hired to look into this sort of thing. So there's a lot of stuff to draw on, and but these reports are almost only in the local languages, and so foreigners don't really know these results, and they're not really intelligible. If you're an English native speaker, then reading Danish is going to be a no. Luckily, I am Danish. And so we're going to focus on Denmark. And the reason for this is that I know the Danish results best because I've been following this research for like maybe 15 years, at least 10 years, like half seriously and a bit more. And I also think that Denmark has the most reports on this, but that may just be me not knowing about the other ones. I also think that maybe Denmark is the least woke of the three Scandinavian countries. And so they're most what can we say, based or like honest, forthright in the kind of data that they publish. And one example here is this is the website of the Ministry of Finance, and the last government we had was some kind of the nationalists were in power, and they told the Ministry of Finance that every year you have to make a report that goes over the economic effects of immigration and so on. And so this is one of these reports. It's published 2019, and it covers what the financial situation of immigration in 2016. So they're a bit delayed, right? But they're coming out every year now. Well, until they cancel them, I guess. But they're coming out every year now, and you can kind of go into these. Usually these reports will be about 100 pages, and they have like tons of graphs and so on. So we're going to be looking at these. And just to provide the background, so a lot of these tables and figures I'm going to be presenting, I didn't translate them, right? So I'm just going to be talking over them and like kind of pointing the mouse cursor at the stuff I'm talking about. And so the way you calculate the net economic effects or benefit of a given person is that you essentially try to figure out all the ways that they contribute to the public coffers. So all the ways they contribute in tax, more or less, and all the ways they spend money from the state. So all their use of healthcare, education, if they get criminal conviction, you try to estimate the police resources they're using, basically all this stuff. And given the complexity of modern modern societies, it's not that easy because, for instance, for tax, the simple stuff is, okay, you just look a given person up in the tax register, you can see how much income tax did they pay, right? But you also pay a lot of other stuff to the state than income tax, right? Then you have tax on capital gains and all stuff. But all this will kind of be in the same tax system. But what stuff is not there is if you pay a tax that's on some kind of product, and so let's say that products that have a lot of fat on them, they are believed to be unhealthy, so we put tax on stuff with a lot of fat on them. And so whenever you buy this stuff, you're contributing to taxes beyond just like the normal sales tax, right? And so that means that for every person or adult, they have to estimate how much money, which fraction of your money are you spending on food, and in such case, which fraction of that money is on these food for this and that, extra tax on it, and so on, right? And so this is an overview of all the things that they're basically trying to include. A lot of this stuff down here is stuff the state is spending on you. So some of these are like pensions. If you get pension, you're old, or you can get a what do you call this, early retirement, right? That means the state is basically paying your salary, right? And then there's a bunch of other stuff that's not included, which will be stuff like insurance costs and stuff. And it's kind of like an invisible price. For the things that they can't estimate for an individual, what they do is that they just split the cost equally. So, for instance, something like the Danish military theoretically guards the Danish kingdom, and so since you can't really say this person is paying for that sergeant over there, basically they just take the entire price of the military, split it equally above persons. So that's how they do this whole thing. And they do the same thing for stuff for income. The tax can't find like a specific way to link to a person. So that way, basically, for every person, you end up with a number. And if you kind of plot this, you can look at the person for different people as a function of how old they are, what kind of net contribution they're making. And if we begin with the left chart over here, and what we have is this is the distribution of expenses for this generation 2013, and these have all the explanations, and I can mention some of them. So the green one here, which kind of grows throughout life until you get very old. This is the individual cost of health. So this is basically stuff that the state is spending buying you health. So of course it maxes out earlier in life when the state is basically spending millions of dollars trying to keep you alive while your body is failing. So that's why it's large later in life. The orange one here is the amount of money the state is paying for income replacements, and so it's basically pensions and unemployment benefits and student stipends and this kind of income. So it goes up a lot after like 65, 70s. So it's of course mostly pensions over here. The red one is education, which obviously starts whenever people kind of start in school. So that begins here like 7th grade or something, and then almost everybody is done at age 30, so it kind of stuff like that. And you can keep doing more of these. You could do the same way like this one for incomes, and but we're just gonna ignore that part. And the way it looks like if you kind of sum these up is that this kind of curve you get here, that's the red one here. If you sum it up, and it's just been reversed or inverted, and so you see the bulge at old age is here, and that's the one up here. And so the red one is the amount of money that you're basically spending, and the blue one is the sum of all the money you're contributing to the state through taxes and this sort of thing. And you just subtract these from the other, you get the net economic effects for your person, and that's the green one. So as it can be seen, whenever you're born, you're not making any income, and the state is spending some amount of money keeping you alive or paying like child allowance money, this sort of thing, to your parents. So as soon as you're born, you're essentially a net negative until about age 25 or so. And so all this time up until you're like 20 or 25, you're not really contributing anything in income. You're just being in school and this sort of thing. And only when you start going on the job market, then you start making a lot more money, and you're not spending money in school. So so your net contribution goes above zero. And so the working age population, the people kind of in this area, these are the people that basically keep the welfare state going. And so when this part of the population shrinks, or this curve is moved downwards, then the finance of the welfare state doesn't work. So that's basically the bottom of it, or the basics of how it works. The actual age distribution of a population, as we can guess from the prior graphs, it has a huge effect on the net contribution you can expect from a given population. And so these are the data for the Denmark, for Danish situation, and the ones over here, these are the first generation immigrants, and the ones over here are the second generation ones, and the dark blue is the Danish natives. And so the red one, these are the non-Westerns, and the light blue, the teal, these are the Western ones, and the same over here. And so what we really see is, if we look at the first generation immigrants, we see that there's not a lot of them that are very young. And the reason for this is that most people that come to Denmark, they're usually more than 10 years old, and often 20s or 30s. And so the age distribution is heavily tilted towards people that are working age for the first generation immigrants. Of course, many of these actually come here to work, and so that makes more sense. And it's the reverse is the case if you look at the second generation of immigrants over here. And what you see is basically the numbers are super tilted to the young ages, especially the non-Westerns. And so this what this means, that the second generation people are too young to really contribute, because they're not old enough to be in the job market. And so if you were to calculate the net contribution of, say, the second generation, it would be extremely negative, because they're too young to contribute anything, and they're just in school basically. And the opposite is the case for the first generations. And so this can be seen on this plot. So the first one here, it covers the same thing as we saw earlier. The red line here is the first generation non-Westerns, and the light blue one is the first generation Westerns, and the dark blue is the Danish one again. So what we see, if we look at the Danish one, we see native Danish people are basically a net negative until almost age 30, after which they contribute a lot of money, and then they exit the job market around age 70 or so, or they just spend too much money on healthcare. For the Western immigrants, the situation is close to the same, but not entirely as good. They have less contribution, especially these later years of the job market, age 50, 60. They apparently don't get as far up the hierarchy, or they're spending more money somehow. Unfortunately, if you look at the situation for non-Western immigrants, the red line here, you see that in this computation, they are actually not net positive at any time in their lives. So what it really says, this plot, is that the average 30-year-old non-Western immigrant in Denmark is a net negative even when they're 30 years old. And the same is true when they're 40, 50, 60. These people can never be a net positive for society, and you could not run a welfare state with this. It would never work. And if we look at the effect of age adjustment, so this goes back to this graph. So what age adjusting really does is what if we basically pretend that the age distribution of say these immigrants is the same as the Danish one. And so you compute the numbers, what they would have been in the counterfactual situation that they had the same age distribution as the Danish one. So that's how you do the age correction. And so that's what's in this plot. And the one is the same all groups repeated endlessly. And so Danish natives, this one, these are the first generation Westerns, these are the second generation Westerns, the first generation non-Westerns, and the second generation non-Westerns. And so the dark blue bars will be the actual net economic contribution, and the teal one is when it's been age standardized. And since, recall, we standardized to the Danish distribution, changing the Danish numbers, of course, does nothing. You're just saying the same thing twice. And so what we see is that the Western immigrants are in the real world a net benefit to society. But if you adjust it for age, you see that they're actually zero. So they're not actually contributing anything if you were to take into their unusual age distribution into effect. If you look at the second generation Westerns, they seem to be in real life they're very negative, but we see that this is because they're very young and too young to work. And if you actually look at the people that are, if you adjust it for age, then actually they're slightly positive, like this, almost the same as the Danish one. So it seems that second generation immigrants are going to be performing almost as well as Danish natives. This is not the case for either of the non-Western ones. And so for the first generation non-Western, we see that they're quite net negative. And once you adjust for age, they're actually more negative. And that's because right now they don't have a lot of old people and they don't have a lot of children. And so, but if they were to have more of these and have a normal age distribution, they would be more net negative. And the opposite is the case for the second generation non-Westerns. Currently, they're extremely negative, but most of this is because they're very young. And if they were to have the same age distribution, they'll still be very negative, but they would be almost a third as negative, which is, so this is what this really tells you is that the light blue lines, these are the ones you can expect long term. So these are the long term forecasts of the net contribution of a given group. And so you basically would want to hope that the second generation ends up looking very much like the Danish one, kind of like this one does. But this one is the problem, right? This is a different way of looking at the same situation. So here we're again looking at Western immigrants over here and non-Westerns over here. And we have the same sort of plot as we had here, but we're going to be splitting it by generation. And so these are the second generation ones. These are the non-Westerns. And so as we kind of saw before, the Danish natives, dark blue and so on. The teal or light blue ones, the line is very wiggly, and that's just because there's few people there in these groups, so you kind of have to estimate it with some uncertainty, and they probably should have smoothed it for a nicer graph, but you can kind of do that in your head. And you see that the teal line here, or the light blue line, is almost as good as the Danish one here. And so that tells us the same thing as the bar plots we looked at just before. And it's the other way around when we look at the non-Westerns. As we saw before, the red line, it never reaches parity. So the first generation immigrants are always net negative on average in society. And when we look at their kids, the light blue line, we see that after they're about 30 or so, they actually turn a net positive again, or they turn a net positive, like the natives and the Western immigrants, but not nearly enough to offset their negative in the other parts of life. And so that's the same thing as this bar is telling us. If we look at a different country, we can look at Norway here. So I couldn't find exactly the same kind of plot with the net contribution, but in practice, net contributions are very highly correlated with employment rates. And so what we're looking at here is the employment rates. I think in Norwegian is like sysselsetting, something like this. And so in Norway, instead of splitting countries in Westerns and non-Westerns, they've decided to do a four-way split. And so the dark blue line is the native Norwegians. And so these are the employment rates for men by age and then by country of origin. And so these are only like working age-ish population. And this is the same thing, but for women. And so group 1 is Western people, group 2 is other EU. So this will be countries that have joined the EU since 2004. So these will be Romania and Latvia probably, and some of these other East European countries. And G3 is basically everybody else. So G3 is the remainder category. So the G3 will include all the various Muslim countries, the African countries, and then a few like East Asian countries, which kind of offset the pattern. But whatever you see, it's very obvious to see what's going on is that the natives have very high employment rates here, and they only taper off around when the age you're kind of getting pensioned. For the other Western people, it's more or less the same as the ethnic Norwegians, and so these people probably aren't a big concern. The other EU, East Europeans, they're somewhat below, especially after age 40 or so. So net economically, we can obviously conclude that unless these people happen to just make more money, their lower employment rates means that they must be a net negative. And that's just because the natives will be approximately in equilibrium. And the red line, it goes up about the same at age 30, but then it very quickly falls off. And so you can figure out easily then that this population must be very net negative, because the only way that they couldn't they could avoid that would be to have like super high income in comparison. But we know that groups that are high in employment rates are the same groups that are high in income, and the same groups that have low crime, and so on. They follow the kind of the S factor approach. If we look at women, we see more or less the same result, except that the non-Westerns, or the remaining category, they top out much lower than the other groups do, and then they decline the same way as the men do. So we can especially conclude that these non-Western women in Norway they must be a large net negative. If we go back to Danish data, we can iterate, of course, that these results refer to individuals and average distributions, right? And so, unfortunately, they don't provide kind of a histogram or something like that. So what they do is that they do give you a kind of bar plot histogram, sort of say, and the colors are coded for which kind of group you're into, and so they split them into 4, in that the red and the green yellow kind of color. The red are the people who are slightly positive for society, and the green yellow is people who are very positive. They're contributing more than about 40,000 over their lifetime, I guess. Maybe it's per year. And light blue is the opposite of the red, and dark blue is very bad. And so these are the proportion of people who are extremely negative. And you see for Danish natives here, the proportion of people who are very negative in the working age population, it's very small. It's about 5% from this, and so that fits approximately the results from New Zealand in that study. People keep citing. For Danish, you can also see that approximately 70% of people are net positive, and so in the same way, like 30% of people are not net positive. And when you look at the other groups, you can see that the distribution is quite markedly different. For the immigrants, you can see that the very negative proportions are quite a lot, maybe twice as large or so. So there's just a very large. There's some 10% of the population of these groups is, even though they're working age, they're extremely negative contributors. So these must be people who just literally never work, or who never work and also are very criminal. So they cost a lot of money in policing, this sort of thing. And there's you can see the proportion of people that are net positive. It goes up quite far, and so it's only about 40% of non-Western first generation immigrants. It's only about 40% of them, even in working age, are actually a net positive. And so that's what this one shows over here. This is the proportion of people that are just net positive, and so it's about 40% for the first generation non-Western, and in their descendants, it's closing up to 50%. But you can figure out that for them to reach parity, they kind of have to go to the Danish level, and so that's where they would hit an economic effect, an economic net benefit of about 0 on average. A different way of looking at this, instead of grouping countries, country of origin, instead of grouping countries, Western, non-Western, and so on, what we can do is we can look at specific origin countries, and not all countries will have enough data that it's possible to make an estimate. But you can make an estimate for about 30, 35 or so countries in Denmark, and so the way they limited is that they only showed the country of origin where there's at least 5,000 people in Denmark. So the ones below that, they considered the estimates to be uncertain and didn't show them. Unfortunately, one problem with this data is that they're not age adjusted. So these values here, they reflect the here and now. And so if one country happens to have a very positive distribution of age, which means if they're all like working age, then the country will be much better looking in this plot than it would than the long-term forecast would be. And the same way, if you happen to have almost only children from the given country, they will be very negative, even though the long-term forecast might be good. Unfortunately, they did not publish the age-adjusted data for the countries of origin, and I did write them, and they didn't want to provide them to me. So maybe they didn't compute them, or maybe they're just being annoying. Who knows? Whatever the case may be of these limitations, we can see that there's some very obvious patterns in the results, and the dark blue ones are the non-Western ones. So these are all the ones here, and the light blue ones are the Western ones. And so we can see, if we kind of do a median split or so at around this place, you can see that most of the ones that are positive are all Western, and almost all the ones that are negative are, on average, are non-Western. And the way you can see is there's a few exceptions, which will be India, for instance. India is here. It's quite positive, even though it's non-Western. And so it's probably the same thing as you see in the US, where it may be that the average Indian in India is not very, it's not highly educated or has a good job and so on. But the ones that do manage to come over here, they will be kind of the elite of India, the Brahmins and so on. And so they end up actually having quite nice contributions. The similar thing for China here. And the one here is Ukraine. On the other hand, over here, we have the only Western one that's negative is Bulgaria. I actually think they should be labeled as Western now. Maybe it was... oh yeah, it is Western. Yeah, I don't know why the Bulgarians are so negative. Maybe they have high crime rates or something. Hard to say. Since this number concerns 2016, that was very close after the Syrian civil war crisis. And so Syria is super negative, but a lot of this reflects many of these Syrians just came very recently, and so they haven't really found time to get a job yet. And the same is true for the Somalians here. And so these values are kind of an unfair estimate of the long-term prospects of these groups in Denmark. A different way of looking at this is that instead of splitting by country of origin, we can split by reason of residence. And so again, these are Danish numbers. And we do the same kind of net contribution calculation. And we can look at these are the immigrants. So the first generation, Western and non-Western. And we can see the reasons for why they're in Denmark. And so this chart relates to people that are without employment. And so we see that for people that came to Denmark for work, that's what erhverv means, but somehow are not employed, these people are slightly negative on average, and that it doesn't matter whether they're Western or non-Western. The same thing is true for people that came here to study. They're fairly net negative. It doesn't matter whether they're Western or this. And this plot is empty here. That's just because this is the people who came for asylum, and there aren't any Western people that came here for asylum, so you can't compute it. This one relates to people who came here as a family reunion, and you can see that these, if you come here for family reunion and you're not employed, you're usually a huge negative. On the other hand, if you do look at people who are actually employed and the same reasons why they're here, you can see that they're all net positive. So the main problem you could say is the people who come here and somehow end up not being employed. And if you look at the people who are employed and the country or the region of origin, Western and non-Western, then they're approximately equally good once you factor into account the reason that they're in Denmark. And the same is true for the students and even some of the asylum ones. I don't know why this one is a bit lower, but maybe it's just a fluke. Different way, again, looking at this, we can look at the same kind of age plot that we had before. With on the y-axis we have net contribution, and x-axis we have age, and so they're color coded this time by the reason that you're here. And we can see if you come here for a family reunion, you can basically see that these people who come here for family reunion are generally speaking not a positive on average. And the people who come for asylum reasons are very negative on average. On the other hand, if we just look at the entire people that come here for work and for studying, these people are almost doing as well, and maybe even a bit better, the ones who came here to work, than the Danish natives. And so if you were to select immigration based on who should come into your country, then obviously these policies of letting people in that come here to study and work here, they're doing okay, right? So there's not a big problem there. Recency effect is I don't know what you really call it, but it's the effect of how long you've stayed in a country as an effect on how well you're doing. And what you can see is that people that came very recently, they don't normally have a lot of employment yet, because you have, whenever you come to a new country, you have to like settle in, find some place to stay, and then if you only speak Arabic and you come to Denmark, then getting a job is probably going to be difficult. The Danish social security or the social services will try to find someone who can help you find a job and this sort of thing once you've gotten yourself settled in. And you can do it about you can look at it this way. And so we have the same split in the reasons of origin or the reasons why you're in Denmark. If we look at the recency effect on employment, we can also look at it in a cohort perspective. And so these are the people that migrated into Norway a given year, and then how long they kind of stayed in Norway. And what we see is that we look at the people that came into Norway in 1992. This is their employment rate for men and for women over here. And so we see the 1992 people, they initially, when they come in, no one is in work, and after about not even 10 years, about 7 years or so, they plateau, and they reach the maximum amount of work that these people are going to end up into. And presumably these would be Yugoslavians mostly. And so so it takes about 8 years or so for you to kind of reach your maximum potential, so to say, at least for men. And you can see the different years, cohorts that came into Norway, they kind of reach different plateaus. So it probably reflects that the people that came into Norway in, say, 95, the yellow one here, it ends up with a plateau that's much lower than the light blue one. And so I don't know who came into Norway in 95, but apparently it's different people than the ones who came in 92, and so on. And if you look at this green one here, then apparently these people did very well. They went all the way up to this. The same situation is more or less seen with women, except that they plateau lower because women just work less, especially immigrant women. But so what if you were to do good estimates of the net contribution of a person at individual level, you would have to adjust in your model for how long they'd stayed in the country. Unfortunately, with this kind of statistics they're publishing, we can't do any further adjustments very easily, and so we just have to keep some of these limitations in mind when we think of it. Here's a similar chart, but for Sweden, and so the x-axis here concerns the years since you immigrated to Sweden, and the y-axis is the net contribution in Swedish money, and it's the same kind of split as before. The blue line is the income to the state from you, and the red one is the expenses to the state for you, and the green is then the net effect. And we can see that this one it reaches zero approximately 15 years after you get into Sweden, and so then it stays almost exactly at zero, and then go after age 40. So it goes, or not age 40, after 40 years of you being there, goes down very negative again. And so you can see that these people, there's almost no area above the zero. So on average throughout the entire life, these group of people will be very negative. And in fact, these values concern refugees that came into Sweden in the 2015 crisis. And so this one would be the most directly comparable to the German experience or the German predictions that we started this with the survey in the beginning. Because the economists are seemingly claiming that after 10 years, that this green line would be basically up here, so that it would be net positive. And in fact, we see that in the first 10 years, it's extremely negative. And if you were to sum the individual years here, it would be massively negative. So the economists seem to be very wrong, unless Sweden is somehow doing worse than Germany on this situation. Here we have again employment rates by origin and generation, and these are back to Danish numbers, and they show more or less the same thing as we saw earlier for Sweden and for Norway. We see that employment rates they go up, especially after age 20. They kind of stay up here for a while and then they go down, and they're lower for the Western people slightly, and even for the second generation. The red one is the second generation Western ones. And for the non-Western ones, they're much lower than the native ones. A different way of looking at it is we compare employment rates by different countries of origin across multiple host countries. And so 1 year in one of these Danish reports, the Danish finance minister decided maybe it was the Danish Statistics Agency decided to get data from Norway and Sweden for the same groups. And so they found these, I think it's 11 countries of origin that had sufficient numbers in both Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. So you can kind of do a comparison. And so the employment rate is shown on the y-axis here, and the country of origin down here. The reason for the fat bars for these three Scandinavian countries is that they didn't include numbers for Danes working in Norway and so on. So these are Danes in Denmark, Norwegians in Norway, and Swedes in Sweden, right? But what you really see is that these bars are kind of similar. The Syrian one is very low, especially in Denmark. Somalian one pretty low. Iraq one fairly low. Poland one pretty high. Thailand one fairly high. Bosnia-Herzegovina pretty good except for Denmark. And so what you can do is that you can plot the performance of an immigrant group measured in the employment rate in say Denmark, and then correlate that with the one in Sweden. So it seems to be if you do this, you kind of get a plot like the one on the right, and the individual country correlations is 0.86. So almost all the variation between groups that has to do with employment rate differences, it's shared between the countries. So it relates to something that the countries of origin have in common, not the host country, so to say. And in this study, I won't go into details, but you can do like kind of a regression, and you can figure out what percent of variance in employment rates actually relates to whatever it is the host countries are doing differently. And it's not very large, maybe 5%, maybe 2%, something like this. Most of it relates to the countries of origin. I only have a few data for Finland, but there is a report with 11 countries in Finland where they did essentially the same kind of calculation as they did in Denmark for the net contribution, and 9 of these overlap with Denmark, and they're shown here. And so on the x-axis we see the Danish net contribution for these regions of the countries, and in Finland on the y-axis, and we see that the correlation is super strong. 0.89, even though it's only 9 countries. So it's not as detailed in Danish, but it definitely provides kind of a replication. So these values will be super highly correlated with the employment rates and crime rates and so on. And if we zoom out a little bit and relate these facts and findings to the international immigration situation, there is this nice plot. I think it's based on OECD data, it's brain data. And what it shows is the amount of immigrants that go to the United States and to Western Europe by the immigrants' own education level. And it's very instructive to compare these. So if we look at the US, we see within every category, almost, the dark color, the high educated one, is larger than the two other bars. And so this is true for every sending region or country in the US except for Central America and Mexico. And so what this really tells us is that this relates to the immigration selection. So the Africans that go to the US, they're going to be very self-selected for being elite. And same for the Middle Easterners, the Eastern Europeans, the Asians, and so on, Indians especially. Indian bar is extremely tilted towards high educated, right? But it's exactly the opposite around for the Central Americas and the Mexico. So these are basically Latin America people. So you see, U.S. is kind of split between getting elite immigration from everywhere except Latin America. If you look at Europe, West Europe, on the other hand, it doesn't look like this. We in fact see there's negative education selection from many origins. North Africa is negative. Middle East is very negative. Many of the other ones kind of have no super strong pattern, like Africa. It probably relates to mixed effects within Africa, because like some countries of origin in Africa, they do send elites to Europe, like Nigerians often do fairly well. But then the Somalis are usually refugees or very low educated people. So you kind of get like this weird heterogeneity in these immigration selection. A different way of plotting the same data is you just take the high education group and you subtract the low education group. So this kind of gives you a level, an immigration selectivity measure by sending region, and they've been plotted here by whether the immigrants are going to Western Europe or to United States. And you see, from a country perspective, what you really want is green bars, or you want bars that are above zero here, right? And so you see for US and Europe, basically US is getting a lot better immigrants due to self-selection. And especially for the Middle East, the US is getting fairly decent Middle Eastern immigrants, and Europe is not. And it looks more or less very nice for the US, except when you look at the Mexico one, where you can just see that they have a huge negative selection for immigrants that come to the US from Mexico. And so, when Trump is saying they're not sending their best folks or whatever, he's basically right about this. That's what it shows. So overall, to sum it up, we have overall net economic contribution of immigrants. They're generally negative in Nordic countries, and it's mainly caused by non-Western people and people who are asylum seekers, and especially for people who have only been there very recently, because they do improve over time as they found work and so on. But mainly people asylum seeking, family reunion, non-Western origin. These are the things that indicate likely low or negative contributions in the future. Not shown in this video, but I've been looking at national IQs and Muslim like origin, and these country level predictors do in fact predict net economic benefits very well. You can click this link if you want to see a presentation on this. The age distribution and recency effects have very large effects on the results, and that's what we talked about. If you have an immigrant population where everybody is working age, then they tend to have much better net contributions than if they all were children who aren't paying tax yet, or also if they were very old people. And so these are things to keep in mind, and sometimes we can get statistics that are corrected for this or adjusted, and sometimes we can't, and we just kind of have to make a mental note of it. But even if you do adjust for age, then the non-Western immigrants are generally speaking large net negatives on average, right? On average. Differences in economic impacts mainly due to different rates of employment and the reason why they're in the country. And so if hypothetically, if you could improve their employment rates, then they wouldn't be so net negative. And this is of course the same thing that if you kind of read these reports, that's what they always say when you read the conclusion is like they go, Yeah, it would be really nice if Western immigrants, or no, if immigrants could just have the same employment rates as Danish people, because then they wouldn't look so bad in statistics and everybody would be happy. But they've been saying the same thing for 30 years or something, so apparently it's not happening. Migrant selection can have very large effects, as we just looked at the two plots. Indians in India versus Indians in US, and Indians in Europe are also fairly decent, but Mexicans in the US are maybe even worse workers on average than Mexicans in Mexico, which is a little, so like the poor Mexicans go there. It's the other way around in Nigeria, where like the elites leave the country. So this is the end of my video summary, and here's a bunch of sources for people who are more curious about these things. Bye.